And we're going to invite our next speakers up here with a rousing round of applause, like you were just about to hear the best music you've ever heard in your life. Okay? And so I want you to sit back down. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And we've got another dynamic duo. You know we like to do things in pairs. All right? So we've got Joanna Stettner. She's a JD, Senior Attorney, Office of the General Counsel, Public Health Division, Centers for Disease Control. And we're going to do this for when they come up, and we're going to do this for when they finish. We're going to bring them in and send them out with a rousing round of applause. All right? We've also got Brittany Bennett. Oh, they're already here. You're here too soon. Come on. Stand up. Stand up. Standing round of applause. Okay. We've got Brittany Bennett McWilliams, JD, MPH, Public Health Analyst Division, and they're going to keep us within the legal limits of advocacy for the CDC. Take it away.
Good morning, or soon to be good afternoon. I'm here not to put toothpicks in your eyes. That's never happened, and I disclaim any responsibility if that does. So I'm Joanna Stettner. I'm a senior attorney with the Office of the General Counsel at the CDC, and I primarily have the great opportunity to give legal advice to our Chronic Disease Center. And I've been working with the CDC for over 15 years now. I know that's really hard to believe. You know, I look like I just left law school. And so I just want to start off really, really positive and say that it's been really amazing to hear all of the incredible ideas and energy in the room, and all of the wonderful things that you all have been talking about keeping healthy and keeping your communities healthy. And it's definitely given me a lot to think about in looking at my community and my family. So I certainly, want to take this opportunity to just congratulate you all and let you know that, the work that you do is truly appreciated. And let you know that what we're going to talk about today is not to make you feel like, oh, no, I can't do anything, because what we're really trying to do is help you understand just a little bit about what those lines are, and so that you can just kind of try to stay within those lines, and also really to let you know that if you have questions, bring it up with your project officer, and he or she will then, work through the chain and bring it up to me. And, I've worked directly with grantees before and answered questions. So, we're always here for you because we really want you to know, what you can and really cannot do. So today, the only thing that we really want to do is give you a very, very brief overview. And so you won't leave here feeling you have to take a law school exam. And just so you understand the parameters a little bit more. So because I'm an attorney, I need to start off with a disclaimer. I'm here to talk about federal law, and so you all have state, local, or other restrictions that could actually apply to the work that you do beyond those that I'm talking to you about today. The other thing I want to make sure that I point out is I'm only talking about your use of CDC funds. Not your use of your own funds, where your own rules may actually apply. So I'm not here to give you limits on what you can do with your own money, only what you all can do with CDC money. So I'm going to take this off only because I feel very vertically challenged. There are a lot of sources of lobbying restrictions, and again, I'm not asking you all to be experts on all of them, but the first comes from 18 U.S.C. section 1913. That sounds a little bit scary. That one actually applies to CDC and federal government employees and not to you all as grantees. But don't worry, lots of other things actually apply to you all. As you know, every year Congress gives us a huge bill called the Appropriations Bill, and in it there contains a lot of different riders and rules that apply. And there are sections 503A to C that are what we're going to primarily talk about today, and those discuss what your limits are in terms of impermissible lobbying with federal government funds. Now, in 2012, the language was expanded, but it's really important to realize that this language has been in place for many, many years. It is not new, but it's given us an opportunity to look at the expanded language a little bit to provide even better guidance than we did before. There's also grant regulations found in the Code of Federal Regulations, as well as in every single one of your grants, there's something called the Additional Requirement 12, which is the official CDC policy that is incorporated into all of your grants. So 503A, I'm not going to talk too much about today. That primarily applies to CDC employees. The section that I want you all to pay particular attention to is 503B. And what's in red is the newer language that was in place in 2012. But the important thing for you all to know is that it basically says you can't use your funds to impermissibly lobby, and we're going to talk more about what that means. The other thing to recognize, though, is that it's not just about laws. It was expanded to also include appropriations, regulations, administrative actions, and executive orders proposed or pending before any legislative body. So it is expanded a little bit more. But the other important thing to realize is that for state, local, and tribal governments, there is an exception where you can participate as an officer of your government agency in policymaking and administrative processes within the executive branch of your government. So, local to local and state to state. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that so you all know that, government agencies have a little bit more leeway because of their particular role in government. 503C, if you read it, is extremely broad. The prohibitions shall include any activity to advocate or promote, basically any restriction on a legal consumer product. We really just read 503C to give us some reinforcing the sensitivities of particular issues, but knowing that what's prohibited in 503C is actually already prohibited in 503A and B. Okay, so I'm going to give you all a quiz. All right, true or false? A subrecipient may use their CDC grant funds to lobby for the passage of a proposed or pending regulation. And I swear I will not remember who answers what. How many say true? Nobody wants to say true to a lawyer, I guess. We're like, false, definitely false. Who says false? Yay, okay. It depends is the real answer. A subrecipient, so what I was trying to get across here is that just like recipients, subrecipients, you all also have restrictions. And your restrictions are tied to your particular organization, not your recipient's organization. So if you're a non-governmental organization and you're a subrecipient, but you're the actual grantee, let's say, is a state and local, that doesn't mean that the state and local rules apply to you. The rules that apply to you are based upon your organization. So no, CDC funds cannot be used to impermissibly lobby for or against pending or proposed legislation, which includes appropriations, regulations, administrative actions, or executive orders. But it was a bit of a trick question because, again, the one challenge in giving advice in this area is that it's very, very nuanced. And so again, if you're a state, local, or tribal government, you may be able to conduct some policy-making activities within the branch of your government. Grassroots lobbying. This is pretty much the only thing I can ever say for sure. It's always prohibited with CDC funds. So what does it mean to grassroots lobby? It doesn't mean that you can't participate in grassroots efforts to encourage people to build healthier communities and educate or even advocacy. Grassroots lobbying means efforts directed at inducing or encouraging members of the public to contact their elected representatives at any legislative level to urge support of or opposition to proposed or pending legislative proposals. So that's kind of a mouthful. So I'll give you an example. Totally hypothetical, completely made up. A non-governmental awardee sends out a quarterly newsletter to tell their stakeholders, including elected officials, about the great work that is being completed in their community with CDC funds. The newsletter mentions a pending state bill prohibiting smoking in bars and restaurants and encourages readers to contact their state legislatures to urge support of the bill. Is this a problem? How many say no? Nobody wants to say no. How many say yes, it could be a problem? Yes, it could be a problem. Because really that's prohibited grassroots lobbying. You're not using that as an opportunity to educate. You're talking about a particular bill and urging support of a particular bill and urging people to contact their legislature to pass that particular bill. But let's change the facts a bit. Let's say the quarterly newsletter just talks about the great work that is being completed in the community. It doesn't mention the bill. It doesn't attempt to induce the readers to call their legislatures. It just talks about the great opportunities that are happening in the community and educating people about why living in smoke-free environments is actually healthier. How many say absolutely, totally fine? How many say there could still be problems, I'm just not giving you all the facts? No, it's really the first. This is an opportunity that this grantee in this scenario has used to educate, to talk about the great work that they're doing. They're not talking about a pending or proposed bill. They're not urging people to contact Congress. And so, I don't see any lobbying concerns about that. In some of these cases, your project officer may ask you to take a look at the newsletter. And again, in that scenario, it only included success stories. It only included information about upcoming events. It was widely disseminated and balanced, so there would have been no issues with that one. Okay, so this should be an easy one. Pursuant to applicable lobbying restrictions, grassroots lobbying by CDC grantees with CDC funds is A, always prohibited, B, never prohibited, C, prohibited under certain circumstances, and D, is completely unrelated to anything about anti-lobbying restrictions. How many say A? A, very good. I think I need to make these harder next time. Grassroots lobbying is always prohibited. Okay, direct lobbying, I won't read the entire definition. We really, it's hard to find really good definitions for what direct lobbying is, but I'll give you an example. So a local governmental grantee uses its CDC grant funds to write numerous emails to their friend. They've been friends for years, their kids play soccer together. The friend happens to be a state legislature. The emails talk about the next soccer game and who's carpooling. It's done at work, though, and then half the email discusses the importance of passing a ban on smoking in public parks. The ban happens to already be proposed in the state legislature. You know the state legislature is working on that at this time. Could this be a problem? Yes. How many say no because they talked about soccer, so that makes everything else okay? That could really be a problem. And that's where things get a little bit difficult because, in the community, we're all friends and our kids may know each other, but actually the state, local, and tribal governmental sort of exception, if you will, for working within your executive legislative relationships really only applies in equivalent branches of government. And I realize that can be difficult to know what's equivalent in certain communities, but in this example, it was really, local to state. And even though you're friends, I mentioned it was done on work time, so that really could be a problem. And one thing I want to mention is, unfortunately, because this is use of federal government funds, to the extent that the money is used in a way that's impermissible, after investigating and giving an ample opportunity to understand what the facts are, those funds could be disallowed for that activity and would have to be repaid. So I've mentioned this several times. There are differences between what kind of grantees and what can be done depending on the type of grantee that you are. But for state, local, and tribal grantees, again, you can work within your own state or local government's legislative body on policy approaches to health issues as part of that normal executive legislative relationship. You can educate the public on personal health behaviors and choices, do research on policy alternatives and their impact. So there's a wide variety of activities that are absolutely still permissible. So one more hypothetical. So things, again, that may or may not have happened, but they didn't happen. Project officer is CC'd on correspondence between CDC grantee staff and a coalition member. The contents of the email suggest that CDC-funded staff and contractors planned a press event designed to influence contents of a proposed ordinance and actions of a city council member. The press event called for citizens to come together and to talk to one another and also to connect with their city council members directly on this issue. The CDC-funded staff directed the coalition members to also work with the mayor and print up flyers regarding the bill. Do you think this email could be problematic? Yes. And, even though I haven't given you all the facts, the actions here were not carried out in response to an invitation. So the grantee wasn't invited in writing to attend. The council members did not invite them to attend, and it wasn't limited to the public health effects of the issue. It was really about the pending bill. All right, I'll skip the quiz. I think you all will get 100%. One thing you'll see, and what I want to mention is that CDC also has guidance that hopefully you all have, but you can get it on CDC's website, and it does list a lot of do's and don'ts and several different examples. The one thing it talks about is non-governmental grantees, and in order to kind of look at this issue and provide some benchmarks, we look to the IRS code, and not because I am an IRS tax lawyer, but just because it does provide some definitions and a helpful benchmark. It is not determinative. But as you know, many nonprofit grantees, in order to retain tax-exempt status, they have long operated under these settled definitions. So under these definitions, non-governmental grantees are permitted to prepare and disseminate nonpartisan analysis, study, or research reports, engage in examinations and discussions of broad social, economic, and similar problems in reports and at conferences, and provide technical advice and assistance upon a written request by a legislative body or committee. So, for instance, for a nonprofit, is it a problem to present materials relating to public policies that may require legislative or executive action that do not include an objective, balanced presentation of evidence? Yes, it's got to really be balanced. It's got to look at both sides, obviously within the realm of the science. And it has to be made available to more than just allies or a narrow or selective audience. It really has to be widely disseminated. So a nonprofit CDC funding recipient uses its CDC grant funds to create materials advocating for the passage of a ban on smoking in multi-unit housing facilities. But it only talks about the benefits of passing the ban, and it was only distributed to their partners, and it relates specifically to the law the grantee knows is currently proposed. That could actually be a problem. And there would have to be a fact-finding to determine whether that was indeed a violation. So another way to look at this is if you're distributing materials and they do all three of these things, that is a red flag. So it refers to a specific legislation or other order, reflects a point of view on that legislation, and contains an overt call to action. So if you happen upon a piece of paper and you use CDC funds to create it and it does all three of those things, that's going to be a problem. Because I'm a lawyer, I have to have another caveat. Just exhibiting two of these characteristics, depending on the type of organization you are, could indeed be a problem. So I want to end before I hand this over to Brittany to talk about some policy-related issues, just to let you all know that there are a whole host of activities that can still absolutely be done with CDC funds to promote your objectives and meet your goals, activities to enhance prevention, collect and analyze data, publish and disseminate results of research, implement prevention strategies, conduct community outreach services, and provide leadership and training and foster safe and healthful environments.
Thank you, Joanna. And Sue, how are we doing on time before I get started? Perfect. Okay, again, my name is Brittany Bennett McWilliams. I serve as a public health analyst within the Office of Policy and Partnerships in the Division of Community Health. And now that Joanna has walked you all through anti-lobbying from a legal perspective, I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about anti-lobbying from a policy perspective and how policy can be used to lead to positive impacts in the area of public health. So on the screen, we see a picture of what we like to call the policy development framework. The image shows how policy development is really a continuum. So the first step is problem identification, followed by policy analysis, strategy and policy development, policy enactment, and policy implementation. And if you'll notice, at the center of the entire process lies evaluation and stakeholder engagement and education. Some of public health's greatest accomplishments were reached through policy efforts. And as we all know, policy development is an imperative function of public health. It is really important to continue to expand the evidence base. Conducting rigorous analyses to identify and report on strategies and policies that can protect public health and prevent disease is a crucial part of this effort. And educating the public and stakeholders about policy strategies is key. Okay, so now we're going to cover some examples of allowable activities using CDC appropriated funding. And please keep in mind, the list on the screen is very general, and there could be a fact specific to your organization that could change the analysis. So first, we'll look at allowable activities for state and local government grantees. Generally, educational media campaigns are not considered lobbying. For example, educating the public through an educational media initiative that addresses the health benefits of drinking water would most likely be considered an allowable activity. Likewise, educating the public about how screen time exposure among young children may displace children's engagement in physical activity would most likely also be an allowable activity. Now we'll take a look at allowable activities for non-government grantees, which includes community-based organizations and nonprofits. Again, similar to state and local government grantees, non-government grantees may focus on public health issues and consequences. For example, educational media campaigns that demonstrate the pros and cons of certain measures are generally permitted as long as those communications are widely disseminated, balanced in their analysis, and avoid an express call to action with respect to specific legislation. Best practices or success stories are also generally allowed. Again, we should note that non-governmental subgrantees are restricted in terms of the activities in which they engage as compared to state or local government subgrantees. Okay, now let's discuss some examples of prohibited activities using CDC funds. As Joanna touched on a few minutes ago, grassroots lobbying is not allowed. Examples of grassroots lobbying include, but are not limited to, calls to action, sign-on letters urging or petitioning support for a bill, and media campaign ads recommending that the public contact their legislators. Lastly, another example of a prohibited activity of using CDC funds is direct lobbying. Again, direct lobbying includes any attempt to influence legislative or other similar deliberations at all levels of government, as defined in a previous slide. Except in certain cases of state and local communications as a part of their normal and recognized executive legislative relationships, grantees are restricted from using federal funds to attempt to influence deliberations or actions by the federal, state, or local legislative or executive branches. So that concludes our presentation. Please remember that questions related to ethics and anti-lobbying are very fact-specific, and when in doubt, seek advice from your parent organization as to whether a particular activity is an allowable use of CDC funds. Thank you all for your time and attention. I know we're getting close to lunch, but we are available to answer any questions that you have at this time. Yeah.
We do have time for questions. Question over there.
Hey, Ashley Bell with the American Heart Association. So we're a pretty conservative organization, and we mostly operate by looking at those IRS rules for 501c3. But as I was watching your presentation, Joanna, I was just wondering, as I was listening very closely about the 503B, because we're sub-grantee, obviously, I was wondering about local school boards and how you all consider those within CDC rules.
Right, so that is a really good question, and we have talked about local school boards, and the answer is, unfortunately, it really depends. I would argue if a local school board is elected, then I think they could be considered a legislative body, and hence there should be some caution with regard to how that interaction takes place.
Dan Robinson with Central Wisconsin Group. One specific and then one general question. The specific question is there any restriction around after a vote has been taken, and let's say a legislator voted in a way that you're like, this really supports the work that we're doing, can we, through any sort of published materials, publicly thank that legislator for their vote? And then the second question is more general, which may be too big in this forum, but if you're working with a coalition and they come up with an idea to say, oh, we really need to do X, Y, Z, and X, Y, Z includes some kind of legislative action, but nothing's pending yet, it's more an idea, what's permissible in moving from point A to point B in terms of working with elected officials and saying, hey, here's an idea?
No, all great questions. As far as the first question, I mean, we have had circumstances where after a bill is already passed, it's done, a grantee has used some media time to say how great that particular action was and how it would help the community. I think we could probably talk further about the advisability of maybe listing specific legislatures, but technically the law says that you can't impermissibly lobby for proposed or pending legislative action. So I would argue that to the extent it's no longer pending, then technically those provisions don't apply. The only thing I would advise, though, is that sometimes things, they're passed, but if the legislature is still in session and they're still talking about it getting revoked, you may want to have some caution and maybe make it a little bit more general than a particular legislature. As far as the second question, working with coalitions is such an integral part to meeting the objectives, and there are some challenges when some of the coalition members are actual grantees and sub-grantees and some are not. And so that sometimes does put people in sort of awkward positions because you don't want to take on the whole attributes of the coalition, but at the same time you don't want to hamper their ability to move forward. To the extent that you're just all sitting around talking and you think, boy, it would be really great if our community had smoke-free parks. There's nothing pending or proposed, and you're just setting out ideas for great policy initiatives. I don't really see that as lobbying. I think where it gets dicey is sometimes people get excited, and the next thing you know, it is actually proposed, and somebody's typing up letters with the coalition's letterhead on it, with CDC's logo on the bottom, saying call your congressman to get this passed, which sounds funny, but people get excited, and sometimes they forget that, oh wait, I'm have my funded hat on. I think it's, you always have to kind of think about what role you're playing and, what money you're using. And the coalition does, have to understand that there are certain parameters that you have to operate under.
Question here. This has more to do probably not only lobbying but also the ethics. As professionals, we learn a lot of information. We gain a lot of information. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of data to share, and many times we may go home and want to maybe email our legislators, our congressmen, about what we've learned and how certain pieces of legislation can help or hurt a certain cause. Where would that put us?
So in other words, you take off your CDC funded hat and you go home and you use your own personal computer and you don't list your affiliation. That's a really tricky question, and some of that may depend if you're. I can't recall if you said you were a state or local, because there are some. We may have to talk offline, because there are some restrictions, and they're called, I believe, like the Little Hatch Act restrictions. But that is not my particular area of expertise. I will say that to the extent you're not wearing your CDC-funded hat, particularly if you don't have your organizational affiliation, I mean, you have First Amendment rights to speak your mind and say what you want. I think the hard part is, because all of us, including myself, I have my work BlackBerry and I have my home, and I've got work people calling me on both, and somehow the hats sometimes kind of meld together. And so that's where you got to be a little bit cautious, because we all use so much of our work materials, and we take it home with us, and we sometimes forget, oh, whoops, I was wearing that hat when I sent that email. So,
quick question here. Is it permissible to just in general encourage people to vote, not one way or the other, but just encourage them to vote?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as a lobbying prohibition, just to say, hey, get out and vote. I think using grant funds to, conduct a campaign is, I'm guessing, outside the scope of your grant, which is something I didn't touch on, so I'm really glad you asked that question. I sort of tend to skip right to the lobbying prohibitions, but actually the very first question you need to ask when you're about to conduct something is, wait, is this an objective of my grant? Is this even permissible in my grant? And so that's the first question. And then once you conduct it and you realize, oh, wait, it is permissible, but now I've sort of gone over the line. But certainly if you're, in your office and or your community and you're saying, hey, go out and vote, it's really important to be heard, and you're not listing a particular candidate.
Yes. Sorry. You mentioned about providing something in the newsletter about, say, just taking on the tobacco issue, that you're educating about the harmful effects of tobacco and secondhand exposure, and you put at the end of the newsletter, for more information, see the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which has, open calls for action on policy and legislation. Is there any temptation, or do we have to put a counter to that source of information?
Well, I mean, that's another great question. And some of this, on social media in particular is so challenging, because you link and then you link and then you link, and of course you can't really know who you're linking to. I mean, I think that if you're doing something with CDC funds and you put a link, I would be cautious that when the link goes to it, the first thing that pops up isn't call your congressman. I think that's a problem, and I think there has been some case law, particularly at sort of the federal government agency level, where we have to be careful, even as a federal government agency, especially on social media, that when we put something on and then it keeps floating around, it really has to say sort of who's affiliated and who's taking responsibility for it. On the other hand, certainly CDC funds grantees, nonprofit grantees that have advocacy and lobbying arms, and that's perfectly acceptable, because under the IRS rules, you actually are allowed to lobby just under a certain amount, which is not the case with CDC funds. So, to the extent you list Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, because on their website they have really excellent resources, and that's the first thing you see when you enter the site, I mean, probably that's fine. But again, to the extent you click on it and all of a sudden it says, call your congressman now, this is the ones you need to contact, and this is their email addresses, that would be a problem.
Yeah, I get not being able to name out specific legislatures and say thanks so-and-so for passing the Clean Indoor Air Act. But couldn't you somehow say, we'd like to recognize Senator so-and-so for being a champion of healthy communities? I mean, just find a way to recognize them in a more discreet way.
Yeah, I think you could. I mean, I think the argument would be that if it's not pending or proposed, it's already passed, and you're really working towards implementation and enforcement and not trying to get it passed.
If we have a local election coming up, and let's say one of our coalition members is running for office, and they really want the support of the coalition in their running for that office, and if, we say, no, we can't overtly support you or anything like that, but they are using their ties to the coalition in their prominence of the community as a campaign tool, what should we do?
Well, I mean, I think that we can't use CDC grant funds, and I think you kind of answered this to, help someone get elected. That would be outside the scope of the grant. But to the extent somebody is using their experience on a coalition to show, look, I've been working for 15 years trying to create healthier communities, and I'm working with this coalition to, create parks and multi-unit housing that's smoke-free. I don't see that as a lobbying issue because we all build upon our past experience. The one thing I didn't mention this time that I should, though, is as CDC grantees and sub-grantees, we want you to go out and talk about all the great work that's being done because people should know, what's happening. I think the one caveat that we've run into is we want you all to not give us credit, though, for things that you've done with your own funds that could really be lobbying related. So we would ask caution with regard to that. We had a circumstance where a grantee came out and they said all these great things they've been doing, and they included, and we passed a secondhand smoke law. That we did get a lot of questions from our friends in Congress and other various organizations about that particular issue. And the fact finding found out that actually that grantee didn't use a dime of our money on that particular initiative or to lobby for the passage of that bill. But they sort of put that all in that same umbrella. So I would just ask caution with regard to that.
Thank you. I have a very specific question. Coming from a rural area, what's your take on having a state legislator be part of your coalition?
I mean, I think to the extent that legislatures are part of the community and they attend coalition meetings and they're part of the process, I don't see that as a lobbying issue because you're not using your funds to impermissibly lobby for the passage of a bill. I mean, I think you just have to be cautious about using the coalition time with your CDC funds to try to convince him to sort of pass a bill, particularly if you're a non-governmental, you have to be careful about directly lobbying. But certainly sticking to the science and saying, look, communities that have passed policies with regard to secondhand smoke have seen a decrease in heart disease and stroke and emergency room visits. I mean, that's a fact, and he or she can take that information and do with it what he wants.
So I have a question as to where the line is as to what is legislation. So especially in regards to planning processes. So one thing we're really encouraging is safe routes to school in our community. And so asking parents and community members to speak up for safe routes to school, which would mean more like using existing transportation budgets, prioritizing infrastructure improvements around schools rather than putting in a new policy.
Right. So, I mean, the only reason that could get tricky is if a planning board or a zoning board is considered a legislative body. We've had circumstances where, particularly in changing zoning, and, people go in front of the zoning board, which is an elected body, then you have to be a little bit careful. I mean, to the extent that you are invited to attend and talk about the benefits of having safe routes to school, which, would be, sort of hopefully kind of obvious to them anyway, that obviously you want children to walk and you want them to be safe. I do think zoning can be a little bit of a hot button issue, though, to kind of think about and make sure that it doesn't sort of cross that line. On the other hand, to the extent that Transportation Department is a governmental entity and they are creating regulations, that is, I would argue, within their own policy-making function and allowable within 503B. Oh, 1 minute, so maybe one more question?
Thank you. Two questions. I think they're pretty quick. So many of us belong to professional organizations, membership organizations, et cetera, who lobby and sometimes have action items in their newsletters and their emails, et cetera, and that information is often shared with coalition members, et cetera. So if you could speak to that and whether it's allowable or not. And the second question, just more clarity on being invited to speak. Often coalition members, et cetera, or the entity, the grantee or sub-grantee is invited to speak to legislative bodies. Sometimes they're speaking specifically concerning a particular piece of legislation, et cetera. So if you could speak a little bit more to that in terms of where that gray line lies.
Sure. So as far as the first question, I mean, what you all do with your personal time or what you do with the time that you're spending as a part of your role in your organization and not with CDC funds on various committees that it may include some advocacy work is not problematic. I think where it gets dicey is, you know, when you're wearing your CDC hat, then you have to be careful that your role isn't to impermissibly lobby for any kind of passage of a bill or ordinance or anything like that. And I don't mean to take this over if you have anything to add to that. No. And your second question, remind me what your second question was. Oh, okay. So there, yes, as a non-governmental organization, you do have to have a written invitation to attend legislative sessions. And, you know, it's a hard line because if you have expertise in a certain area and you have the science behind it and you discuss, you know, why smoke-free parks is so important in the community, I would argue that that's not lobbying. I do think it's a little bit of a challenging role to play because you can't impermissibly directly lobby and you can't grassroots lobby, but I think you can certainly provide your opinion and your expertise and the science behind it. Does that answer the question, kind of? Sure. Okay. All right. Well, you all have been doing some great work, and I can tell by the questions that you're really being thoughtful about this. So if anything else comes up, you're certainly happy to find me or Brittany walking around the conference.